Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today is Dr. Maria Church, and you can find her online at drmariachurch.com and on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Dr. Maria Church with no spaces or periods or anything like that. So, Dr. Maria, thank you very much for joining me. I know that you have a focus on the area of leadership. I know that you do a lot of work with top corporate leaders, and you work a lot with government and with, I read a little bit that you had written recently about the silver wave is coming, and baby boomers retiring all over, and
Yeah,
what do we do about it? And so, thank you very much for joining me on the Speak Like a Leader podcast. And I'll let you just tell people a little bit about, where you come from and why you care about this. And then we can just jump into talking about whatever comes up.
that sounds great. And I don't think we'll be at a loss for words because leadership is, I'm a leadership geek. So it runs through my blood. I get excited about talking about leadership and like maybe too excited. And some people are wondering, well, that's an interesting person. Yeah. So as you said, I work with primarily today, it's been local governments. Have a few corporate clients, but I'll tell you, John, a couple years ago, I made a decision to really focus on local governments for a number of reasons. One is that silver tsunami that you're talking about. I think it's hitting a lot of private organizations as well, a lot of corporations, but I especially see it so prevalent in local government, where a lot of the positional leaders throughout cities and counties are retiring and are baby boomers.
Yeah.
A lot of them. And, within the next couple of years, 60% of local government employees will be eligible for retirement. 60%. I mean, that is a lot of people. And
Yeah.
what's equally disturbing is that there's only 5% of current college students that are even remotely interested in public service. So that could lead us with a potential, significant gap of people. And I don't know about you, but I really like having my garbage picked up. I like going to see bands in the park play in the summertime. I like the police officers getting the bad guys and gals off the street. And, it's kind of a scary thought because I think we take for granted that those services will just always be there. And so I saw a real need for leadership, to develop leaders in that industry and also to help their cultures really transform from very bureaucratic structures to ones that are more innovative and flexible and malleable because of our current environment. We're in a constant change and a constant flux of change. And so the old bureaucratic structures may very well have worked for a while, but are not working today. So we really needed to change very intentionally and strategically those organizational cultures from a leadership perspective to make them not only survive, but also more attractive to our young millennials that are in the workforce now.
Well, I was thinking about this a lot recently, a little piece of what you said, particularly because I just keynoted the Government Performance Institute's summit, Government Performance Summit recently. And I was thinking about what I get for my dollars from, I guess I'll name names. I had Xfinity as my provider, my internet provider. Not super happy with what I got for my money there. And then I thought about, what I pay annually in taxes and all of the stuff I get. And I just think that it has become I think we're really taking government for granted. And there's been such a cry of, how bad government is and how bad they are with money and no more taxes and everything, that people have really lost sight of just how much we get from government and what a great value it actually is.
Yeah, and especially at the local government level, which is really our
Yeah.
cities and our counties.
Yeah.
And sometimes they get lost in translation and sort of lumped in with big government, right?
Yeah.
But it's our neighbors, and it's people
Yeah.
that we that are in our neighborhood, that we shop with, that we might go to church with, that our kids go to school together. And it's really, these are folks that are really giving back. They're
Yeah.
the ones that are really making a difference in our community. And I'll tell you, from a business perspective, I grew up in corporate. I worked for a Fortune 500 for 15 years, led the sales and
Mm.
marketing division for a land developer and home builder. And before that, I worked for 5 years in local government, which was really, really rewarding and great
Uh-huh.
fun. But I'll tell you, when I was at corporate, I really felt a sense of like having to check my soul at the door. That I really couldn't bring my whole self to work. It was very compartmentalized, and
Yeah.
I remember looking around and thinking, there's got to be a better way um, to lead an organization and to motivate people and to communicate with people, in really important and powerful ways. And that's when I decided to go back to school, and I earned my doctorate in organizational leadership.
Mm.
So I took a really deep dive in leadership theory, and was
Yeah.
learning different models. I mean, a plethora of models.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, John, because I didn't really find anything that spoke to us as holistically,
Yeah.
mind, body, and spirit. And so I actually began my educational journey then at this point, thinking about my dissertation. And I had decided that I was going to develop a new model of leadership that was really holistic in nature,
Mm.
because I didn't like checking my soul at the door. It didn't feel authentic. It didn't feel whole. And so I developed love based leadership, which is a holistic model based on three pillars: love of self, love of source, and love of others. And what was really interesting is that when I started forming my committee, interviewing different faculty, I started getting some resistance from
Mhm.
faculty for this dissertation topic. And I remember I was so frustrated that I think I might have actually pinned the dean up against the wall at some point, and I said, what is going on? I have so much support from my cohort and other colleagues to do this, but yet I'm getting this resistance from the university. And she very plainly said, Maria, I think it is a very important model. I think it's one that's needed, and I think you need to put that forward out in the world. But you have to wait until you have doctor in front of your name, because the university won't support it. It's too controversial. Can you believe that?
I mean,
Love is too controversial. And
well,
and you know what? How can you have a discussion, an advanced discussion of leadership, and not talk about the most powerful force on the planet?
well, it leaves something to be, it means the discussion's missing something, Maria.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that that is in large part the a huge amount of the standard discussion about leadership out there, which, and there are a lot of little places, where but it's almost in the side notes of everything, like I have definitely found that the best leaders that I've ever worked with and or supported are people who just genuinely love other people.
Yeah.
And y- eh, eh, you know and yet I it's too controversial.
Well, I begrudgingly, went ahead and put it on the shelf because, of course, I needed to do my dissertation and graduate.
Mm.
But I did eventually put it out there. 10 years ago, I published Love Based Leadership. And this is kind of cool, John. I don't know if you knew this, but
Yep.
it is the 10th year. And I
Congratulations.
actually
Yeah.
completely updated and revised it. And I have a brand new version, a brand new book coming out in December that is the 10th anniversary edition of Love Based Leadership, the model for strength, grace, and authenticity. And
Wow.
that's
Well,
coming out very shortly. Yeah.
let us know when that comes out, and we'll put it in the show notes so people can find it immediately.
Great. Yeah, I'll send you a link. We're actually doing pre-orders right now on Amazon, so I'll be sure and
Fabulous.
send you the link for that.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. And so 10 years later, doing the work, both in corporate and in local gov, I've seen a lot of love-based leaders emerging, and I've seen a lot of effectiveness when people are genuinely loving and caring and valuing, their
Right.
people. And of course, we had the great privilege of hanging out together with about 30 other people that are jazzed about leadership on Necker Island last year.
Yeah.
And,
That was amazing.
talk about a gathering of love based leaders. I mean,
Yeah.
seeing people like Sir Richard um, Martin Luther King III and President Santos of
Oh my
Colombia. I mean,
gosh.
all
President
talking about
Santos.
the power
Staggering.
of love, right?
Yep. Yep.
Powerful, powerful stuff.
Yeah. Let's say that you are working with an organization that's maybe a little bit not into the woo woo California woo woo stuff. You can't really lead with like things like love based leadership. Let's just say you're in that situation, even though you might not put yourself in that situation. What could somebody in that organization start to do to implement some of the things that you talk about in a way that wouldn't necessarily garner the pushback that you actually got yourself in your educational institution?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, not everybody is comfortable talking about love, which kind of breaks my heart a little bit, but I get it. I like I
Yeah.
said, I grew up in corporate. So I get that. I understand it. The really powerful thing about being a love based leader is that you don't have to shove that down people's throats. You can lead in a love based way. You can teach competencies and skill sets that are love based approaches without saying the L word,
Yeah.
and so um, that certainly is what we do. I mean, when you look at the soft skills, which I always kind of chuckle with too, the soft skills of leadership are usually the most difficult skills for people to gain, and
Yeah.
to really focus
Yeah.
on. It's like the number one and number two challenges in nearly every organization in which I work is communication and trust, or trust and communication. The order may change, but I'd have to say probably 96, 97% of those organizations say those are their number one and number two challenges. Well, that's part of that soft skill set.
Yeah.
And so, you can teach competencies, you can teach people strategies and actions and behaviors to build trust. We can teach people how to move from communication to really connection. We can teach those kind of things and still not have to talk about the word love.
Yeah.
So, I'm very aware of that. And I'm also not tied enough to the ego that we have to talk about love. What's most important to me is helping teach that, and helping develop those competencies, those love-based competencies in leaders, so that they can make a difference, so there can be a ripple effect. That's what I love about local gov. I can go into an organization and help them really shape their culture, and it's fabulous for the organization. But when we work in organizations like local government, that goes out into the community. That
Yeah.
just reaches further and further out in concentric circles. So it's pretty cool. But I also have to say, I've had on more than one occasion, gentlemen in particular, who have approached me after a keynote presentation, where I'm talking about love-based leadership, to come into their organizations and talk about love and trust and forgiveness and those kinds of things, which I think is pretty cool, pretty exciting. In fact,
Yeah.
just a couple of years ago, there was a director of public works. So you might have like a mental image of what that person, may look like or whatever, and you're thinking it's probably a pretty buff or brawny fella, you might be just automatically going there. And that wasn't too far off from the description of this particular director of public works. And he had asked me to do leadership development with his team. And he specifically said, will you talk about the head and the heart connection too? And I
That's
said,
great.
absolutely. Yeah. So, some people are comfortable with it and others are not yet.
I mean, and I think over the last 10 years, there probably, I would say that that's become like a more, even though it's still kind of a controversial topic, I think it's become, it's breaking its way in,
I
Well,
completely agree.
I wonder, was there a moment, Dr. Maria, when you were, because I was going to ask you when you went, so I'll ask you both of these questions. The first one actually prompted the second one that's probably more relevant. But when you were getting your doctorate in at the university, what was one of the biggest surprises that you experienced in terms of what you had kind of thought going in and what you discovered once you were there? And I'm going to say that possibly the answer is just how controversial love-based leadership would be. But what was a moment when what was your aha moment about that? So it could be two separate questions, or it could be that first question just led to the second question.
Yeah. So obviously that story that I shared with you was a huge, shocker for me that we couldn't talk about the most powerful force on the planet. But
Yeah,
I have to say it was really a whole bunch of little ahas that just reinforced what I intuitively knew seemed right.
yeah,
And that I'm reading the experts, a variety of experts, not just one person touting the same thing, but a variety of people who really, really went there and talked about the importance of not just communication, but real connection,
yeah,
really connecting with people. I read a lot about, of course, the power of trust and a lot about the destructive nature of fear. And it
yeah,
really was such almost a validation as well as an aha that yes, this is truth. This is not only just, for a better humanity, but this is true for a better workplace, which of course,
yeah.
if it's going to mirror a better humanity, if our workplaces are full of humans, then, it's going to mirror a better workplace. And
Right.
I think the biggest thing that really struck me with aha was reading about innovation and learning about organizations that are very innovative and creative and why there are some that are and some that aren't. And in
Mm,
particular, I read several studies done by two Japanese researchers, Nonaka and Nishigishi, who extensively studied innovative organizations. And they wanted to answer that question. Why were some organizations more innovative than others? And what they found was all of those organizations that were innovative had this energy, for lack of a better word, called BA.
mm,
And what they found was in every innovative organization, BA existed. So cool. Now it begs the question, well, how do we get BA to come over to our organization and hang out, right?
good question. Yeah.
And so they started peeling back the layers of those organizations where BA existed. And they found that there were four organizational cultural elements in every single one of those BA organizations. And those four elements was love, care, trust, and connection. So, in other words, in order to be innovative in your organizational culture, you must have very prevalent love, care, trust, and connection. And that was a huge aha for me
Yeah.
because
That,
it was truth. It felt right. It totally resonated with me.
yeah. I mean, I think that if you want to say that each person has essentially at some point a finite amount of energy to expend in a day, if they're in an environment where they feel safe and they're not expending energy worrying about backbiting or how they're going to pay rent, they're going to have a lot more mental energy for innovation and looking at things newly.
Yes. Yes. And is that not trust, right? Because you're
Yeah.
not worrying about somebody stabbing you in the back.
Yeah.
And it's connection because
Yep.
you're feeding off of each other, you're trusting each other to be vulnerable. You're in a safe environment where if you fail, you're not going to get a pink slip.
Right.
You're not out of here. And that makes so much sense because
Yeah.
it takes X number of failures before you innovate, right? I mean,
Yeah.
innovation typically
Yeah.
doesn't happen right out of the gate. So, if you're in an environment where you're going out on a limb and somebody saws the limb off, you're not going to go out on a limb again. It's just not going to
No.
happen. So it's so simple. It's so simple, and yet we've made it so complex.
Yeah.
And we've made things much bigger than they need to be if we can just almost go back to those basics of love, care, trust, and connection.
Mm.
And you can't have love and fear happening at the same time.
You, you know,
One is the antithesis of the other.
agreed.
And I think we are, up to our eyeballs with fear. I think we've just had enough.
Well,
We're done.
you know, I don't mean to sidetrack us, but I guess that's kind of why we're here, right? Is to pursue interesting avenues. So if there's anything you want to come back to, put a pin in it because I want to ask you a question and I don't want to sidetrack us from anything else you wanted to say.
Yeah.
And I just finished reading this book by a guy named Brian Hare. And the funny thing is, I met Brian. To me, the funny thing is, I met him several years ago at this conference called the EG conference, which was kind of like it was a conference put together by some of the people who had originated TED. So it was very TED like. And I spent quite a while talking to him. And when while we were talking, I told him all about this fabulous theory called the cooperative eye gaze theory and how awesome it was. And I was just going on and on. And when I was all done, he looked at me and he gave me this big grin and he said, "That's my theory." And it turns out that it was his theory. He was one of the co-authors of the paper. And so that work has progressed and transformed into this book that he just released that I highly recommend it. And the bottom line is that we human beings in the upper Paleolithic, there were multiple versions of humans. There were Neanderthal and Homo Denisovan, I think is how you pronounce it, and Homo sapiens, right? And all of a sudden in the upper Paleolithic, they all died out and we just took over the world. And the question is like, what happened? And it turns out that, according to his book and theory, we self domesticated. And long story short, we gained the ability to be good to each other, even outside of our very smallest groupings. And so, and I think I'm sure that it's a term that's probably more broadly known than I realized, but theory of mind. We all, human beings, all have theory of mind, which means that we can imagine what other minds are thinking. Yeah. Well, we developed theory of mind, like we have theory of mind for both negative and positive acts, but fundamentally, our closest relatives, great apes, chimpanzees, let's say, they have theory of mind when someone else is trying to take their stuff or when it's competitive, but they don't get theory of mind when it comes to cooperating. So fundamentally, we self-domesticated, and it made it and got very, very good at cooperating with each other. And one of the chemicals that that facilitates that is oxytocin, right? The bonding chemical, the bonding
Mhm,
hormone.
mhm,
But what I didn't realize is that it's a two-edged sword. And that bonding chemical is also the chemical that shuts down our prefrontal cortex when we are looking at others, in quotes, who we feel threatened by. And, and the leaders of our group over here are saying they're animals, they're not even human, right? Well, when we feel threatened by another group, oxytocin just shuts down our prefrontal cortex, and we have no, they're like, you can watch people's brains in an fMRI machine in real time as they are, you know, doing their thing. People lose all cognition that that is another human being, and that's why we're able to have
mhm,
genocide. And it made me
mhm,
really clear about what I think is so wrong with politics today. And I'm
mhm,
saying right here, right now, it's going to be public whenever it's public, but I'm saying it, I'll say it other places before. I am going to watch myself really carefully and not use dehumanizing language. I'm going to speak
mhm.
out against any politician that uses it, and I will not vote for or support anybody on any side, no matter what their politics, if that's their stock in trade.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
that was a lot.
it is yeah, no, no. Oh my God, so fascinating. So you didn't tell us the name of the book.
The name of the book is Survival of the Friendliest.
Oh, I love
Isn't
that.
that fabulous?
Oh, I
Survival of
love
the
that.
Friendliest.
Survival
Yeah,
of the
I
Friendliest.
think you'll love this.
So yeah, I definitely, and it's, I'm such a bibliophile. It's like, oh, a book. A lot of
Yeah,
a lot of other people I know, and I certainly had my time where it was like, oh, shoes, or oh, handbag.
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
and
it's
for
good.
me, it's like, oh, book. My husband's
Yeah,
like, oh
I
God, not
hear you.
another book in the house. But yeah, that sounds great. So many things were happening in my mind as you were going through this, and I could really, I mean, we all have seen, especially in the United States, over the last probably 12 months in particular, has really escalated the divisiveness of our
Yes.
country, and sort of the cracking open of injustices that have been happening, and people are speaking out and up about it. And yet it's so interesting because while we have and historically have had certain levels of divisiveness, something like the tragedy of 9/11, and all of the destruction that was happening in DC and
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, and certainly
Yeah.
in New York City, that when the people were there showing up helping, race didn't matter, gender didn't matter, sexual preference didn't matter. None of that mattered because we saw each other as additional humans.
Yeah.
And so it was that oxytocin that clearly took over. And of course the way the world responded to us,
Yeah.
even people that we weren't on friendly terms with, politically,
Yeah.
and globally, that always rises.
Yeah.
Fear is powerful. There is no doubt about it. And probably many of us have seen, and maybe some of us have even used fear as a strategy to motivate people in a direction, because it does work. Fear does work. But the
And
problem
it has
when
its place. It has
what's
its
that?
place.
Yeah,
It
and there are times when that might seem the appropriate strategy or technique. The problem is they forgot to tell us that it comes with a price. So if we leverage fear, or if fear was leveraged with us, we
mm,
know that price is lack of loyalty, certainly
mhm.
lack of trust,
Yep.
definitely lack of communication because it doesn't feel safe anymore. And then we start planning our escape.
Yeah.
We start beefing up our LinkedIn profiles, we start our networking, we start daydreaming about it's got to be better somewhere else. And fear, again, it works, it has worked historically, but I'll tell you, and we know this, in the end love always trumps fear. It always does. It is
Yeah.
still the strongest force out there.
Well, and just so anybody listening is really clear about what I meant, there is a gift of fear is a gift, right? We don't get afraid unless there's something well, we do now, but I mean, fear keeps us alive. Fear
It's safe. Yep.
gets our attention, right? So, but in a leadership context, I just don't think that the command and control, fear your leader kind of thing, that just doesn't seem to me to have legs.
No, and it's not sustainable for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
let's make this real. So, suppose a team worked on a project, they sent in the final report, yay, we're celebrating, and then they get it back, and it's all wrong, absolutely all wrong, and they have 24 hours to get it right. Now, the leader could choose a couple of different strategies. Two come to mind. One of them could be that the leader says, "Oh, holy crap. We're all going to lose our jobs if we don't get this right in the next 24 hours. So if you want to keep your job, you got to just plan on an all nighter here." Okay. That's one
Hmm.
strategy, and probably
Uh-huh.
one that happens a lot. Another strategy is, wow, we missed the mark. We've got 24 hours to make this right. I'll call for pizza. Can somebody send out for coffee? And let's see how we can get this done.
Yeah.
And people are going to show up. The end result could very well be the same, but people are going to show up differently for that, right? It's going to be a
Well,
different energy level and probably a different commitment to getting the job done.
and there's neurobiology that would suggest that people are going to be far more creative and innovative in the second scenario than in the first.
Oh, of
In the
course.
first,
Love,
all
care,
of that,
trust, and connection, right?
yeah, and all of that energy is going to get used up first for freaking out about what to do because now I'm going to lose my job in 24 hours, right? If we
Sure.
don't get this right. So, definitely, I think the second version works better in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if we have to show up in a creative way, we've got to remember, what it takes to get Ba to show up there,
Yeah.
to help us be creative, right?
Yeah.
So, I have to ask you because, I shared with you, my clients typically say that trust and communication are their two top challenges. And I know you're such a passionate person about communication. Does that surprise you?
No.
And if not, why do you think we're challenged when we're in the communication age? I mean, we've got communication
Yeah.
ability 24/7, right?
Well, I mean, in a way, that's the problem, right? Like it's all the shiny new toy and the bad examples that we've seen. And what I say, Dr. Maria, is that communicating with human beings is not logical. And people always laugh, that like, yeah. Well, it's not. It's not logical. It's biological. And if
Mm,
you want to be truly successful, logic is necessary. Yes, you've got to have a plan that works, or else let's just not even talk about it because those people don't make it in the door. We're talking about already high functioning organizations or groups or whatever. So logic is necessary, but that's kind of table stakes. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And communication and trust are absolutely inextricably entwined in my
mm,
book because where trust comes from is the part of the brain that's really old and ancient and does not have access to language or logic or reason, but it
mhm,
does have access to reality on a fundamentally deeper level than we'll ever have access consciously. It smells things like pheromones, it sees facial micro expressions, notices all the absolutely unconsciously sent and received body language, all of that stuff. And that is the part of the brain that at the end of the day must give what I call the fourth and most important yes. When people they go in and they pitch or whatever, they trying to raise money and they get the yes, 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 no. Well,
mhm,
that's easy to explain in hindsight. People get very upset about that, but it's simple. Yes, yes, yes. Logically, they were in. You had the logic. No. So yes, 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 no. Logic, 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 emotion. We
mm,
didn't make the emotional connection. And that's because most of what we see modeled in the work world, especially other places too, most of what we see modeled is not only not what works when it comes to communicating with human beings, it's almost 180 degrees the opposite of what works. I don't want to show any weakness. I'm not going to let my emotions come up. I'm not going to let people know anything about me personally. Like, okay, who's going to ever trust that person? Sorry.
Right. Right, because they're not human. It is our emotions
Yeah.
that really make us these beautiful humans. And you're absolutely right. We will never truly connect. When we're talking about
Yeah.
communication, what we're really wanting is connection, right?
Yes.
People
Yeah.
confuse information distribution as communication, and that's not it.
Yeah.
Communication is, wow, you get me, you understood me, you
Yeah.
heard me,
Yeah.
I heard you,
Yeah.
and that's that emotional component,
Yeah.
100% the emotional component. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's funny. I was working with a client this morning, actually kicking off a full year culture initiative to really shape their organizational culture to
Uh-huh.
accurately represent who they are and who they want to be as a county.
Yeah.
And we are starting with why. We have to get really, really clear on why why this organization exists, why we chose that particular organization, why we chose the job that we did within that organization.
Yeah.
And I kicked us off with watching the Golden Circle TED Talk,
Simon
and
Sinek. Yeah.
yeah, totally talking about that part of our brain that's the emotional
Yep.
part. And
Yep.
and unless we reach that emotional part, there is no connection, and that's
No
hence the
connection.
yes, 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 no.
Well, and look at the biology of it. The neocortex, the new brain, is wrapped around the ancient paleo mammalian brain. It's wrapped around the outside. So for logic to get to the spinal column to take action like signing a check or standing up and volunteering or whatever, it has to go through the emotional part of the brain, the ancient part of the brain. Even if the logical brain's all in,
Mhm.
it's still got to go through that ancient part. And that is all about the emotional connection. If you don't have that, you don't get that fourth and most important yes.
Yes. Yes. I totally agree.
But I
100%.
but that's so not not what we see modeled very often, right?
Mhm.
There's and
Yeah,
that
and again, we've complicated it. We've
well,
really complicated it. I mean, you think about the communication process. There's a sender who has an intended message, and they send it to the receiver, and they receive the message.
yeah,
So that's a pretty simple process. But of course, those of us that have been challenged at different times of our life with effective communication know that there's a whole lot of stuff in the middle called noise, right?
yeah,
And it's the noise that keeps us from really communicating effectively. And so we really have to be very mindful and consciously aware of what that noise is, and it can be obviously the literal noises, but
mm,
can also be those figurative noises, like my mental model might be different than your mental model. My
yeah,
perspective is probably different than your perspective. And being having that level of self-awareness to recognize that, oh, my perspective might not always be the right perspective,
right,
and that's the vulnerability part. And so if we're in an environment, or we're of the belief that we're in an environment where we can't be safe, i.e. we can't be vulnerable, we will never have effective communication, because we've stopped that and blocked that emotional part of it.
exactly. And everything else that anybody wants at that organization is now going to be, hamstrung by that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said something really profound earlier, that trust and communication are forever entwined.
Yeah.
And so I'd just loved, because I agree with you, but I'd love to get your perspective on that interrelationship of communication and trust.
Well, so I think first of all, the that that trust arises in the ancient part of the brain. Trust is an emotion, it's not a logical construct. And so we trust people when they communicate with us what their emotional connection to whatever it is we're talking about is. When we understand where they're coming from and why they care, now we have a place to begin to trust them, and a place to connect with them, a place to begin to feel like we're in the same tribe. And that's the genesis and I think the core nugget of trust. And so
Mhm.
if people aren't willing to communicate who they really are and why they care and that kind of thing, then I just think we never get that initial seed that trust can then begin to accrete on, would be how I'd say it. Would you agree, or what do you
Yeah,
think?
no, I was totally there with you, and it made me think about a point that you made me really think about that phrase. I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care.
It's fundamental. Look, that is absolutely, in my opinion, the bottom line. The
Hmm.
bottom line. Maria, I worked with well, I guess I can't say that. I worked with a large corporation on their global summit a few years ago, and
Hmm.
everybody wanted to get up on stage and establish their credibility. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. Like, look, they paid $1 million for this stage and they put you on it. Like, your credibility is established. Stop it. We'll just ruin your credibility with that. What I want to do is, it's what I work with everybody I work with on, Maria. We find their superhero origin story. And it's not about being a superhero, it's about being your origin, right? Why you care. And I had each of them come up with a story, and we made it really well told, and we polished and everything, but they were all just little vignettes about why they cared about what they did now. One guy showed himself sitting next to this really gigantic thing that he had been a part of designing and back in the 80s. And so his hair was hilarious. And
Hmm.
everybody gave this little personal nugget about why they cared about what they were doing now at this large corporation. And it was the best event they'd ever done, the woman told me. And people, they just couldn't believe the amount of connection, and people ran to the breakout sessions instead of running away from them. And I had to think about it for a while, but I think my next book is going to be called this. We didn't establish their credibility. What we did with those little personal stories that were purposefully crafted and well told was establish not their credibility, but their emotional credibility.
Nice.
And after that,
Nice.
everything, the world's your oyster once you really authentically, it cannot be a manipulation, it has to be real.
Absolutely.
But once you
Absolutely.
actually do that, the world's your oyster. These stories are like a red carpet that just roll out in front of people and just smooth the way for everything that they do and anything they want.
Yes. It really is establishing their connectability.
Yeah,
Because people now
absolutely.
can connect with them. They relate to them, their relatability, and especially with successful people,
Yeah,
air quotes, right?
yeah,
Successful people. And certainly with leaders within an organization, we somehow, with the title or the prestige, we somehow almost dehumanize them. And
yeah,
not in the same way that we were talking about earlier with dehumanizing and marginalizing, different groups of
yeah,
people.
yeah.
But we do, in a sense, dehumanize and make them, like superheroes,
I think we
put them on a
superhumanize them.
pedestal. Yes, okay, good, good. Yeah, we superhumanize them. And so they're up on this pedal now, this pedestal,
Yeah.
and in our eyes then they are unrelatable
Well,
because they're superhuman now. They're
yes,
not relatable. And heaven forbid that they fall off the pedestal by doing something human. And it can
right.
be very, you know, damaging to that team or that organization. And so, what is it going to take for us to really celebrate and seek out that authenticity in leadership so that the perceptions, the relatability, the connection can still be human to human, you know?
Well, it's a really good question, Dr. Maria. And two thoughts I have are for both sides of that equation. So for the person that's the leader like that, that's one of the things that I work on really, really very hard with people is making sure that they become aware of how they appear to others from the outside versus how they think they appear or how they might feel about it. And
Mm-hmm.
then making sure that they very consciously understand how to humanize themselves, connect with people, start to open up some vulnerabilities. And there's a term I'm trying to coin called insightful vulnerability, and vulnerability with some insight, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and share those places where you fell down and what you learned. And so for the person in the leadership role, if they're doing that continuously, they're going to be decreasing that problem. They're going to be taking away that superhumanization as much as
Yeah.
they can. And on the other side of the equation, I've become really convinced, maybe looking at myself as an example, that we attribute that superhumanness to others just so that we can get out of doing the work to be that good, you know?
I hadn't thought of that, but perhaps you're onto
It's
something
how
there.
we get off the hook, man. Like that guy has natural talent. That woman is just naturally good at stuff, you know? Yeah, no, that, you know what? Steve Jobs practiced an hour for every minute he was going to be on stage after they wrote the talk.
Mm,
45 hours of practicing a 45-minute speech. Like anybody would be pretty good
mhm,
at that point, but nobody wants to do the work. So Steve is a natural communicator.
mhm.
So I think that it's, both sides can take some responsibility for that.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's a great point. I think that the authenticity, in fact, the work that you do that you describe, that's exactly why I felt called to write that book, about leading with love, about love-based
yeah,
leadership, because I felt that compartmentalization that I believed was expected in the workplace, and I was certainly taught that that's how you led. You compartmentalize all these different parts of yourself, and you never, bring your whole self to
yeah,
work.
yeah.
It just was never authentic. It was never
No,
authentic. And I'll
no, it's
tell
a
you,
disaster.
it is. I remember a very chilling um, event when I really, really came into awareness around how crazy that kind of thinking is.
Yeah.
And one of our employees at the organization, her daughter, who was like 19 or 20, died in her sleep.
Oh,
I mean, it was
oh,
horribly tragic. Death oftentimes is, but
yeah.
especially so when it's a young
So
person like
young
that,
and
right?
yeah,
And of course, it just shook the employee, her mom, to the core.
oh,
And we closed the office. We closed all the offices down, the golf course, the country club. Everything was closed down so that we could all attend the funeral. And I remember in church, everybody was crying, whether they knew
mm,
this young woman or they just were crying for her mom, and the
mm-hmm,
pain. And I remember I was starting to cry, and John, I realized, oh my gosh, and I was in a senior leadership position, and I realized, oh my gosh, I am with the people that I work with, and I'm with my team, that I lead,
yeah.
and they can't see me cry, and I shut it down. I
Oh,
just shut it down. And I remembered feeling almost chilled by that,
mm,
chilly, you
yeah,
know? And if anybody would have seen that happen, I'm sure it would have been visibly noticeable
yeah,
because I sat up straighter, and I was emotionless. And
yeah.
can you imagine if somebody who maybe didn't know me that well, or maybe somebody that did, what they were thinking in their mind? What a cold hearted person that is,
Well, but
no
it's
emotion.
but it is what I think many people think is expected of them. And I think it's an absolute horrific disaster. I think we die younger because of it. I think we die more often. I think people aren't fulfilled. I think people feel, they quit their job and feel rudderless, or they feel rudderless at their work. I mean, how crazy is that? That's
I
crazy.
know.
This is where we
It's
spend
insanity.
our
It is
time.
truly insanity. And I was very good at it. And I
Yeah.
realize that's really nothing I should brag about publicly, but I was very, very skilled at that. And I'll tell you, I paid the price.
Yeah.
I had horrible IBS for
Mm,
years. Horrible. I ended up having to get 18 inches of my colon removed, my intestines.
yeah.
I ended up with cancer, breast cancer a few years
Mm,
after that. I mean,
mm.
it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that if you shove your emotions down and you become a superhuman
Yeah,
or
quote unquote.
non-human,
Yeah.
then your body will eventually say enough.
Yeah.
I've had enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very destructive, and not only emotionally and spiritually, but physically, very
Yeah.
destructive to really continue leading like
Yeah.
that.
Well, it sounds like you have changed your ways and you're making amends now, which I'm very happy about. And I don't know if you know this, Dr. Maria, but my last big .com company was a company called bigwords.com, and we raised over $80 million in the .com days. And then in the downturn, our investors pulled the plug and we went out of business. And I almost died of an autoimmune disease and then had a really rocky, not fast recovery. And one of the big realizations I had was that an autoimmune disease is me attacking myself with my own body. And where was
Mm.
that start? Now, look, it was real. All the symptoms were real. It was coming from someplace. It was very real. And I really took on that it was all starting in how I was being with myself mentally,
Mhm.
and really went to work on loving myself and letting go and forgiving myself and letting all that shame and guilt and anger and sadness, just
Fear.
letting that go, right? And I
Yeah.
think I think now, like, this is maybe one of the things. Maybe we should have another conversation sometime soon, but I think that this is one of the places where love-based leadership probably runs into a whole lot of headwinds. Is I realized I don't think I can be a safe space for anyone else if I'm not truly a safe space for myself. And I
Amen,
have
brother.
to really love and forgive myself first. And
Yes.
that has just made an enormous difference in everything from my success to my health. And it sounds like we have a very strong resonance in that.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, the first of the three pillars of love-based leadership is love of self.
Yeah.
It's
Well, that makes
just gotta
total
be.
sense.
We've got to get ourselves together from the aspect of loving ourselves. And within that, I specifically talk about 7 factors of loving ourselves, and that's everything from intuition to truth telling to
Yeah.
truth receiving, recognizing our power of choice. Too often we play victim,
Yeah.
and we always have the power to choose, at the very least our attitude. Perception
Yeah.
shifting, I think, is one of the strongest tools in a leadership toolbox, is the ability to perception shift and look
Yeah.
at situations and opportunities from a variety of angles, and how we show up, and health and wellness. We're
Yeah.
smart people today. We have a lot of knowledge. But yet we put better gasoline into our cars oftentimes than we put food into our bodies. So, it's really, really, truly, what does loving ourselves look like? And it's far beyond bubble baths and pedicures, although I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of the bubble bath and the pedicure. But,
Yeah.
it's much more than that. It's much more substantive than that. And like you said, that forgiveness and just really tapping into who we are authentically, and what brings us joy and peace and happiness is just so key, which of course takes us right into the love of source. It's like once we start really loving ourselves and then we connect with, that essence, that vitality, of something greater than ourselves, that's where inspiration comes from, and
Yeah.
perseverance and peace and love. I mean, it's the heart center, right? And then if
Mm.
you can imagine, loving yourself and then connecting with source, whatever that source is for you, then the
Hmm.
automatic extension of that is love of others.
Yeah.
And that's where, forgiving other people come into play, building trust, creating knowledge, collaboration, shared power, shared ownership, all of those aspects of really loving others, loving the people that you work with, loving the organization for what you're doing, what your mission is, and how you're changing people's lives and impacting people's lives. I mean, that's the juicy kind of stuff that gets us out of bed on Monday mornings.
Yeah. Yeah. And on Tuesday, when it feels like Friday already, we're talking in the
Yes,
middle
we've
of,
had a couple of those. It's so funny. I once heard somebody refer to uh, being in COVID, being in the 6th month of March. And I thought, well, that sounded like a pretty good description there. Yeah.
that is so funny. I love that. That's so funny. This is 6 months of
Yeah.
March. Yeah,
But yeah,
that's
I mean, we
really
all have days like that, right? But it really is that connection with our, taking us back to the very beginning of our conversation, that deep, deep connection with our why,
yeah. Well,
just takes us
let me
right
ask you
back
a
there.
question about that because it might be a painful story, and this is a safe space if you want to or not to tell us. But I'm starting to think I might have some insight. I'd love to hear what the real story is about how you went from compartmentalizing and just shutting yourself down to be at this big land developer corporation. And then obviously it probably paid pretty well and you were senior, leader there. So what was the moment when you made that change, and what do you mind telling us about it? Is it seems like a
Yeah,
significant moment, I guess.
yeah, I think that was a really significant moment for me to be aware of that. And I actually started working with a therapist because
Uh-huh.
I felt such an uneasiness, and like I said, I felt like I checked my soul at the door.
Yeah.
And what she did, ironically enough, is she helped me reconnect with my emotions, and
Oh,
she taught me how to cry again.
wow.
And so that's kind of the short version. And that was around the same time I wanted to earn my doctorate and go back to school because I felt there was something more. I
Yeah.
just, in my heart, John, I just felt that there was something more.
Yeah.
And I really felt that that set me on the trajectory and on the path that I'm on today, which is really, I mean, my personal why is, shifting the workplace from fear to love.
Great. That's I'm behind you on that. I support you fully. Now, did your physical issues have any impact on your decision, or was that later
So my
or
physical
before?
issues, I became aware that they were really tied to that um, emotionalist, compartmentalized way I was living. I really
Yeah.
understood that, and that the surgery to resection um, the intestines, the 18 inches that were
Yeah.
removed,
Yeah.
that actually happened shortly after I left corporate and started my own company. And
Uh-huh.
then 2 years later is when I had breast cancer. So I had already left corporate.
Mm.
But I think what was happening is, the damage was done, and it was coming out literally. It was literally coming up and coming out. I
Yeah.
had just really centered myself, I would have to say, spiritually and emotionally. And what was left was to take care of it physically. And so
Yeah.
that illness, um, that insanity really physically had to come out of my body at that point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would think that probably you leaving that toxic situation was what had you live through all that.
Yeah. And I can honestly say, had I not, we wouldn't be having the conversation today
Yeah.
because I don't think I would be here anymore.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
you
that's
know,
how
like,
profound that was.
and so what would you say to someone, Dr. Maria, who's in a situation and they're going, oh my gosh, I know exactly what she feels like tomorrow. I've got to go into work and check my soul at the door. I don't know what I'm going to do. Help, what would you say to them?
Wow, that's a great question. And my short answer, since we're almost at an hour, I'm looking, it's like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe an hour has gone by.
It's been really
So
fun
my
talking
short
with you.
answer is that I would ask them to really get very clear on their personal why
Yeah.
and very clear on what would feel authentic for them in the way that they if they felt the freedom to show up in their full authenticity, what would
Mm,
that look like? Because I think sometimes we self-limit ourselves.
yeah.
And if we got really clear with what our authentic leader looks like, our authentic worker looks like, then I would say try it out. Try not to self regulate and self limit to really show up in a way that's authentic for you, because they might find that their authentic self is welcomed.
Well, yeah, you made me think about the fact that one of the things I always work with myself and work with leaders on as well is talking to people like they're great no matter how they're being in the moment. And one of the keys to really having that turn out is to never be the one to stop, right? Like, I will talk to you like you're great and you may get it this week or next month or next year, but I'm going to do my darndest to talk to you like you're great till you get it. Now, in the meantime, if you're an employee of mine and it's not working out, I might have to fire you, but I'm going to fire you in a way that honors your greatness, acknowledges your poor performance here, and says, I hope you find the place where you can really shine. And I think that how that ties to what you just said is it's entirely possible that there are people that everybody at the corporation feels like that. And if you're the first one to stop checking your soul and you show up with your soul and you start living into who you really are and what would authentically work and make you happy and be what felt good to you, it's just possible you could foment a revolution there. And maybe the business would actually, and probably the business would be wildly more successful doing something better, and you
Hmm.
could start it all.
Right. And if it's not well received, is that really the right fit?
Yeah, right.
Because
Exactly.
who wants to be in a
Exactly.
place where they can't really be their authentic self?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I mean, and it's scary to be in that moment, and it's really scary to think about all the what ifs. But I really, really believe deep in my heart and soul that what you want, what you genuinely, actually, authentically want, wants you.
Mm,
And
I love that.
I remember hearing that the first time, and I just got goosebumps to my ankles. And believe me, I was not in a place where what I had was what I really thought I wanted. I've shifted a lot of stuff since then. And I think that that really helped me a lot. And I would offer that to anyone who's listening who feels trapped in that check your soul at the door place or any place else. What you want wants you, and the universe needs you to go get that and go pursue that instead of giving all your life energy to something that's not good for you or for it.
I love it. Well, that's just a beautiful note to end on, isn't it?
Yeah. And what a lovely, lovely trip to have gone on with you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Oh,
And
it's been my pleasure. Like I said, do you want to talk about leadership? I am so there. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your listeners.
you're super welcome. And we'll look forward to doing it again sometime.
Love it.
Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.